Glenn, all eyes remain on this case regarding Kilmar Abrego Garcia, the wrongly deported migrant to El Salvador. Trump had initially said that he would respect the Supreme Court's ruling if the Supreme Court ruled that he had to be returned to the U.S. The Supreme Court did indeed rule exactly that the Trump administration had to facilitate his return. And that note was put on full display in the court case. Basically, the plaintiff said that Trump's own words were that he would respect the wishes of the Supreme Court in facilitating his return. Then Trump took to Truth Social and undermined his own point. I'll put the post right up here on the screen. President Bukele has graciously accepted into his nation's custody some of the most violent alien enemies in the world, and in particular, the United States. These barbarians are now in the sole custody of El Salvador, a proud and sovereign nation, and their future is up to President B and his government. So now it sounds like Trump is going against what he had initially said, which is that he would respect the Supreme Court's wishes to bring him back to the United States. Now he's just basically wiping his hands of it and saying, he's out of our hands at this point. So what do you make of this?
What I make of this, Brian, is this is Donald Trump in substance giving the Supreme Court the middle finger. Let's just follow the bouncing ball of injustice here, because it was just 2 days ago that, as you mentioned, Donald Trump said, and I quote, "If the Supreme Court said bring somebody back, I would do that. I respect the Supreme Court." And Brian, that was in response to a reporter asking him whether he would bring Abrego Garcia back if the Supreme Court ordered him to do so. That statement, the very next day on Saturday, made an appearance in the court filing by Garcia's lawyers. And here is what they said. First, they quoted Donald Trump, as I just read, and then they went on to say, of course, that is precisely what the Supreme Court did when it ruled that the court's injunction, meaning what Judge Shinez ordered the Trump administration to do, facilitate the return of Garcia from that El Salvadoran prison, it properly requires the government to facilitate Garcia's release from custody in El Salvador and to ensure that his case is handled as it would have been had he not been improperly sent to El Salvador. So now, Donald Trump, I'll tell you, if he's king of anything, Brian, he's king of the flip-flop, because after he said, I will return him, I will respect the Supreme Court, then he posts something that says, as you just read, basically, Garcia and the others that I wrongfully deported to El Salvador are now in the sovereign control of El Salvador. The inference there being, and there's nothing we can do to bring him back. He didn't say that last part, but Brian, that was the clear implication of that post. And as I say, that is a direct FU to the Supreme Court. And now when all of these parties make their way back into court, it's on. And I think Judge Shinez will have some very choice words for the DOJ lawyers representing the Trump administration on this issue, and she will probably feel compelled to move toward contempt of court if Donald Trump's DOJ lawyers maintain, just as Donald Trump posted, nothing we can do, because now Garcia is in the custody and control exclusively of El Salvador.
And so I guess that really is the question here, is whether these DOJ lawyers are going to allow Donald Trump to do his posturing in public, but still abide by what the Supreme Court and what this lower court now have to do, which is to facilitate his return, or if they're going to completely reverse course and just say, well, some errant synapse fired in Donald Trump's brain and words fell out of his mouth, and that becomes our new guiding principle here. Is that correct?
Yeah, so it'll be interesting to see what position these DOJ lawyers take, because, with every flip-flop, Donald Trump is cutting the legs out from under his own DOJ lawyers in court, kind of making a mockery of the rule of law and the Department of Justice. I'll tell you, I would not want to be in the position that these DOJ lawyers are in. Remember the last one who spoke candidly, accurately, and truthfully in an earlier hearing in the Garcia case? He was removed from the case, and I believe removed from the department altogether. He was certainly put on administrative leave for being candid and honest and truthful and accurate in court, as was that lawyer's supervisors. I mean, this is a really dirty game that Donald Trump and his Attorney General Pam Bondi are playing. So it's anybody's guess as to what the DOJ attorneys go into court, I believe, on Tuesday, which is the next scheduled hearing, unless the federal court judge brings them in early on Monday, what position they will take. But let me just say, I think it is a laughable and insulting position for Donald Trump's Department of Justice to maintain that we snatched up Garcia, we disappeared him unlawfully and unconstitutionally, and in direct violation of an earlier court order prohibiting the federal government from deporting him to this country, specifically El Salvador. We then directed that he be put by the El Salvadoran government in a prison in El Salvador. And Brian, we are paying to have him housed there. Basically, he is our prisoner once removed. We are footing the bill. And then in the next breath, are DOJ lawyers really going to say, but we have no control over whether, the El Salvadoran government will allow us to bring Garcia back? That's laughable. That's insulting. And I would bet my full dollar that will not fly in federal court at any level, trial court, appeals court, or at the Supreme Court.
We've spoken about the prospect of a constitutional crisis, and I think that I want to delineate between a general constitutional crisis in that we have a president who is so overtly hostile to the Constitution as it stands, but then as it relates more narrowly to the courts, this would be a scenario where it would take a ruling from the Supreme Court, where they're the final arbiter of this question, and the Trump administration defying that court order for there to be, at least on the legal front, a constitutional crisis. Would this finally be that moment, and what would the implications of that be?
Yeah, so we use that term a lot, constitutional crisis, and Donald Trump has intimated, if not come right out and said, I respect the Supreme Court ruling and would act accordingly. But you know what? I don't really respect or feel necessary to comply with trial court rulings that tell me, the chief executive, what to do or what not to do. Here's the thing. He can certainly resist trial court rulings, but the only way he can do it lawfully and constitutionally, Brian, is if he files an appeal. And if at some level some judge issues a stay of the trial court ruling. Otherwise, it really is a constitutional crisis, even if it is just defiance of a trial court ruling, not a superior court ruling or opinion. But here's the other thing. Because of the Supreme Court's language in the Garcia case, that opinion they handed down, which said, listen, we are directing the Trump administration to facilitate the release and be prepared to share with the trial court judge, quote, what you feel you can share. Here's the thing. The mealy-mouthed, imprecise nature of the Supreme Court ruling in the Garcia matter does, for better or worse, give the Trump administration a little bit of wiggle room. So what I see now is I see this thing making its way back up to the Supreme Court fairly promptly. And given that Donald Trump just gave the middle finger to the Supreme Court in substance in that recent post, that it will be time for the Supreme Court to put up or shut up. And I hope what they say is, no. In case there was a misunderstanding when we told the Trump administration to facilitate his release and treat him the way he would have been treated had you not unlawfully deported him to El Salvador, this is an order, this is an edict, this is a directive that you may not disobey. That will be the moment at which this matter will ripen into an absolute textbook constitutional crisis. And at that point, Brian, all bets are off because there is nobody to compel the Trump administration to comply with a Supreme Court order if he decides to completely shit all over our constitutional construct, our separation of powers, which requires each branch of government to respect the lawful authority of another branch of government, and the Supreme Court wins that battle. But if Donald Trump defies it, we are then in completely uncharted waters.
What do you make of the fact that the case Trump decided to test his hand at in basically defying the courts is one where the justices ruled 9-0 against him? It's not like he would have, look, if he's going to defy the courts, which I think we all kind of expected him to do, not that it makes it any better to do it on a 5-4 decision, but it would probably make a little bit more. He would probably have a little bit more sympathy, at least from the conservative bloc of the court, to do it if it was 5-4 or 6-3. But to do it on a decision that they ruled against him 9-0, doesn't that seem like it would make it just a little bit more difficult for him to be able to carry out this act of defiance?
Yeah, Brian, it's a great point. So let me sound like I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth. It makes no sense, and yet it makes perfect sense. It all depends on what the Trump administration and what Donald Trump's goal is. If his goal is to not alienate the Supreme Court when there is a case where there is indisputable evidence, indeed a confession by the Trump administration that we deported this person unlawfully, unconstitutionally, and in violation of a court order, why in the world is that the hill you would choose to die on? Because you are likely to inspire the wrath of the Supreme Court. So it makes no sense, but it makes perfect sense if your goal as Donald Trump is to reach as far and as wide as you can to grab hold of all the power for the chief executive, for the president of the United States that you can, including sending a signal to the Supreme Court. I don't give a rat's ass about your supreme status over the executive branch when it comes to these constitutional questions. I don't care about the construct of our Constitution or the balance that is represented by co-equal branches of government being able to check one another. I don't care about any of it. You just try to enforce that court order to bring back Garcia that you handed down, and I don't believe you can do it because you don't have an army and I do. That would make perfect sense if that was Donald Trump's motive behind his decision to die on this hill, the Garcia deportation and return hill.
Well, look, this is obviously moving pretty quickly, and we will have some degree of at least resolution, answers here in the next couple days. So for those who are watching, if you want to follow along, please make sure to subscribe. I'll put the links to both of our channels right here on the screen. It's the best way to support our work and the best way to support independent media more broadly. So again, if you haven't yet subscribed, please go ahead and subscribe.